thanks everybody for coming. So, I want to explain a little bit of what we're up to tonight, because who knows why you decided to come tonight, but I'll give you the reason, what we think we're doing. We'll see if what we're going to do matches why you came. But basically, it's obvious from the title of tonight, The Future of Energy, that we want to explore the question, the future of energy. It's probably difficult to find a bigger question. It's arguably bigger than a religious question, and for many people it is a religious question. So it's a deadly serious question, and our feeling was that the way you start seriously thinking about this question is to invite some of the best minds who work on that their whole lives to start opening up a little bit about what are the kinds of things that are going through their heads right now on this issue, and quietly think our way into this question. Why are we doing that? Because, as you probably know, the relationship with Oldcastle Building Envelope has been basically transformative inside the school. It's really the first time the school got very, very deep into the world of material construction and fabrication and so on. It came out when we worked with Ted Hathaway and what was then called Oldcastle on the Glass Conference, which gave way as Oldcastle became Oldcastle Building Envelope, to the amazing GSAPP project, the Columbia Building Intelligence Project, which in some ways has revolutionized the way we teach in schools of architecture, and that's become now a kind of a virus, and I think it will spread from this school to other schools. And for the first time, we've found ways in which kind of parallel processing and more or less open source collaborative design environment becomes part of the inside of a school of architecture, but not by accident. Scott and David and Laura chose energy as the kind of key way to judge that kind of radical sharing of ideas and so on. And not by chance, they were working on Plan NYC as the sort of model for this. So when Ted and I were thinking, well, what's the next stage of the Building Intelligence Project? Where will this partnership between Columbia and Oldcastle Building Envelope go? There was the thought that we have to really ask seriously the question, what is the future of energy, which means taking seriously all of those words, like especially future and energy, not presuppose that we have a very good grasp on what we mean by future and a very good grasp on what we mean by energy. But as you can imagine, I would be inclined to say that if you gave a very, very detailed description of energy, you would also at the same time be constructing the kind of model in which you could speak about the future. It's arguable that you cannot think the question of future without thinking the question of energy. Since universities are places for thinking, this is what we are going to do. And I just want to note that this is meant to be a very, very quiet beginning for a series of discussions like this that are much more debates than lectures. They're much more the kind of PowerPoint-free zones. Which means they're like one of the very small parts of our world that are not dominated by PowerPoint, in which brains will open up and we allow this question to be asked in many different ways. At some point, this school will decide in partnership with Oldcastle exactly what major research that we will attempt in this area. And this evening is meant to be a very quiet but quite distinct warning shot that something huge is going to be developed here which will make the GSAPP project look absolutely tiny. Sorry, Scott. But the GSAPP project, which is arguably the biggest transformation of the inside of the school, is about to be challenged by this new venture with Oldcastle Building Envelope, which I believe will be equally transformative. And once again, our interest is in how that might expand to other schools and so on. So I just want to, again, if I had a hat, I would raise it again to Ted Hathaway, who has been foolish enough to commit his time and thoughts and the support of his company to work with us on these questions. And for us, this has been absolutely transformative. And I just, I can't thank you enough, Ted, for this. And what's so exciting for me about this Future of Energy project is we have no idea what it's going to be. And yet, there is absolutely the conviction that this is arguably the single most important project that this school will take on. So I have this amazing combination of not knowing the future of the school, but believing the future of the school is absolutely tied up into this question. how we answer the question of the future of energy. So it's really thrilling that we were able to trick Craig Schwitter to come in and talk with some of these wonderful people tonight to begin this conversation. But Ted, I think you should say something, like one thing, two things. It's a conspiracy.
Yep. All right. So Ted Hathaway, Old Castle Building Envelope. I'd like to congratulate the School of Architecture for persuading us to sign up again after CBIP. Mark and I have this convoluted relationship. We're always reinterpreting what we've said. And I just, to me, personally, and I've been in building products now for 26 years, it's the conundrum of looking around the corner and trying to figure out a solution that no one anticipates. So I'll give you just a set point. It may or may not be relevant to power, but I find power a relevant term for tonight. So I'm a different generation. I'm a vinyl guy. Okay, I bought music on vinyl. Okay, so by a show of hands, how many of you are vinyl people? All right, you're vinyl. Some of you are too young to be vinyl. Right?
Coming back.
So when I look at innovation, and I look at transformation, I look at the way music has been transformed by digital innovation. So when I grew up in the 70s with the Grateful Dead, right? And I bought music on vinyl, and then the next step after vinyl was, help me out here? 8-track. All right, you're close. We went from vinyl, right, to 8-track, to cassette, to CD, to MP3, to cloud iTunes, right? So what I would ask you to think about in the context of tonight is there was an ultimate transformational solution, which was digital distribution of music. And no one saw it until someone recognized there was a push, and it was, let's record digitally a soundtrack, and let's press it to vinyl, let's put it in an 8-track which broke, let's put it on a cassette, let's put it on MP3. Oh, wait a minute, let's start over. Let's really start over and push it digitally over the internet. And that's what I hope will come out of this, is that kind of groundbreaking insight and transformation in the way we look at energy and the way we look at architecture. Because I think we're missing the boat. And I've been here for a quarter of a century, and no one has really fundamentally, I'll challenge our panel, no one has fundamentally addressed this so that everybody has a common reference. So we have this proliferation of interpretation of what is energy, and how do we measure it, how do we design around it, and how can we solve our carbon problem. And if any of you have any vinyl, I'm a buyer. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. All right, I hope that wasn't too...
So you can see why the friendship with Ted and with Oldcastle has really just been my favorite thing in this whole gig that I'm doing here. Anyway, handing over to Craig, who's a great guy, and Craig is not easily described. His Swiss Army knife doesn't have enough blades in it to fully explain him. There's hardly an aspect of what it takes to produce a building that he's not right in the middle of. This is all the way from the scale of a mega infrastructural scale through to kind of micro detailed scale. And there are not so many people in our world that have that kind of span. And again, the future of energy question requires that as a minimum setting to span all the way from massive, potentially global infrastructural scale through to kind of micro, local, and interactive scale. So it's absolutely great that Craig Schwitter has put this panel together with us and is going to run the show from now on. PowerPoint.
All right. Thank you very much. Just a couple of rules of engagement. No PowerPoint. Okay, sorry for those junkies. I get tired and more tired of just too many images. So tonight is really just about talking to our panel. It's really, for me, important. I have some questions. We're just going to be asking those. We'll have a dialogue, probably about 45 minutes, and then I'd really like to open it up to dialogue with everyone here, and so we can get some cross riffs on that. Just in terms of introductions, Bill Browning from Terrapin, Bright Green, says here, Terrapin Bright Green crafts high-performance environmental strategies for corporations, governments, and large-scale real estate developments. Also know these guys as one of the leaders in sustainability in New York. They straddle policy and design in a very unique way, and have a way of coming at problems that, shall we call, maybe not as intuitive as you might think. And I think his input will be extremely interesting and important tonight. Ariella Maron from Happold Consulting, actually a part of your Happold company. Ariella is an experienced urban planner with a sustainability background. She has previously worked for the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and was one of the principal authors of the energy chapter of Plan YC. So the person that wrote many of these things that we're trying to follow is sitting right here at the podium. So thank you. And I think also Ariella has not only a political but also an economic and planning background. I think that helps in terms of deciphering some of the problems that we're talking about. And finally, Stephen Selkowitz from Lawrence Berkeley Labs. These guys do just amazing things. It says here, an internationally recognized expert on window technologies, facade systems, and daylighting. Lawrence Berkeley Labs is much more than that. I mean, they hold some of the best research and data for solving some of these problems that you can possibly think of. And if you are interested in this problem, you should go onto their website because they make it all free. Well, as Stephen said earlier today, not quite free. You do pay taxes, but it's amazing.
47% you get paid.
And seriously, I really, if you don't know the resources that LBL offer, they really are an amazing organization, and I'm very happy that Stephen's sitting here at the panel. As just a quick intro to this, a couple of buckets of ways of thinking about such an incredibly broad topic. First is why buildings? Okay, just buildings in general. Hopefully, most people know buildings occupy typically quoted as 40% of the energy footprint in the United States. Most Western countries, that's the same. Equating maybe energy and carbon there, it's a big number. It's a number that most people don't realize. Most lay people outside of the building industry really recognize transportation and other things as being critical, but we all know that buildings, the solution to buildings really, and the solution to lower energy footprints for our cities are really interwoven. In the last 15 years, there's been there's been a generational change on architecture, but also there's just been so many things going on. From the issue of cost of energy to security issues associated with energy, technology moving, there's a lot here. And one of the things I think that's very interesting is are we, and I'll ask this question in a different way, are we moving in just buildings to an area where we're looking just to simply improve on what we have, or are we simply standing back at times and waiting for a quantum technological leap? This is a question that I'll be asking later. And second area is markets and regulation. This is a fascinating one. What can be market driven? What really needs a type of regulatory framework to be pushed through? These are not simple areas of that we can necessarily decide one or the other. Codes, again, quoting you from today, the code is the worst that you can do on a building that is legal, and it really begs the question that do we have the right types of regulatory frameworks in place to really push the industry forward. Third area is energy sources, looking at how energy sources may well be changing the building industry. Finally, and I think this is a wrapper around everything, is climate change. not necessarily the argument of whether it exists or not, whether how the impacts of climate change are going to be affected by the building industry. There's certainly a lot of political will. You can see last night there was a lot of political will now in the arena, and how that might be changing over the next couple of years. So on to some questions. The first question I'll put to Stephen here. What are the key energy drivers for buildings today and over the next 10 years? And how have these drivers changed from 20 years ago?
Simple question, right?
Simple.
Simple, right? So I think this is a moderately complicated field, and the other thing about the building sector is it's not homogeneous. There's a lot of different pieces and parts of it. Homeowners look at the problem differently than commercial building owners and so on. There's been competing trends here where buildings are becoming more efficient because of codes and standards and other things like that. On the other hand, there's more stuff going on inside of buildings now. We're running all those MP3 players and stuff like that that we didn't have in an office before. And the net effect, and there's data out there, and I don't recall the details right now, but the net effect is by and large we haven't made a lot of progress with buildings in terms of overall energy use. I mean, the totals keep going up. California's, I'm not a native Californian, I'm from the Northeast here, but California's got a record, there's a chart if I had my PowerPoints, that if you look at electricity use per person in the country, it's gone up about 20-25% in the last 30 years. California's been flat. So that's good news, except that's per person. The population has gone up by 30%, so energy use has gone up by 30%. And if you try to understand where that's coming from, well, the average size of a house got bigger. The average square footage of office space per person got bigger for a while. It may be getting smaller now, I'm not sure. But there's a lot of these different trends going on. Some of them are driving energy use higher, some are driving energy use lower. Trying to disentangle them and to understand the problem is actually not trivial. And then parts of this are driven by economics. People pay some attention to prices. Economics is actually a pretty small driver. We've had, I don't know what you're paying for gas out here now, it's up over $4 a gallon again in California. I've never understood that in 30 years here because we generate more gasoline in California than probably any other state, and the prices are higher there. There's a couple of different reasons for that. But it wasn't until gas prices actually got above $5 momentarily a year or two ago that you actually saw a demonstrable change in the way people thought about getting from point A to point B. And if you look at Europe, of course, it's $8, $10, and $12 a gallon. There it has changed the way people commute and the way people think about lifestyle. But incrementally changing the price of energy for most of the population is not a driver. It creates huge hardships for a fraction of the population, but the majority of it, frankly, looking around this room, looking up here, most of the people here, energy use is, I mean, my annual energy use is less than my internet access and my phone access and all that other stuff. So as a utility, it's not at a level where if I didn't care about it for other reasons, I would pay a lot of attention to it. So that's not driving change, or it's not driving decisions that people are making in a major way. I think one of the challenges is actually understanding where those decisions are coming from. Is it the owner that drives the decisions about energy use? Is it the architectural, the A&E team? Or is it the suppliers that maybe the owner and the A&E team want to do a great job, but it's just not possible to do that? And in general, one of my themes is that although we have good intent, we talk about net zero, we talk about all the great things that we want to do. If you go into the field and measure what's really going on, the results are less than great. There's been some studies out there of looking at what the expectations are for building performance and then measuring what they really are, and there's a gap between there. And the reasons for that gap are kind of interesting and probably worth some more discussion. But I'll make one more comment. The electricity grid, so 40% is the total number. 73% of all the electricity in the U.S. goes into buildings. So you hear a lot about smart grids, and you hear about lots of things about the electric grid. The grid is all about supplying buildings. And there's actually a push to move the building sector more towards electricity and less towards other types of fuels, which could be good if the electricity comes from wind and solar, and could be bad if it comes from coal and other sources. So the grid is a separable but important part of what's going on.
All right, well, you just jumped ahead like
sorry about
14
that.
steps, but that's not, that's pretty typical for Stephen. Bill, to this issue of some of the drivers, but also efficiency measures, there's a lot of good practice out there. And I would like you to comment on something that we often see the low-hanging fruit being drying up. That the areas of energy conservation or reducing demand are getting harder and harder to do. Is this real? And do we actually understand how we get deeper into, say, a net zero type of approach with buildings?
I'm going to jump back to the piece on Stevens first.
All right, you guys are impossible. That's all right.
And that is, part of the problem with energy for buildings, when I'm driving around, I can see my gas gauge going down, right? And sometimes, particularly, if you look at behavior, people who have hybrids, you'll find that they will game the car because they'll look at the performance numbers and all that, and you'll find a fair amount of the hybrid drivers will game to play performance games. And we've seen a number of things where companies have a fleet of them, and then it becomes a competition within the fleet about who's got it. So we see within fleets of higher, when a company has a fleet of these things, people start competing. When I get my utility bill at home at the end of the month, or the month after, I have no idea what things in my house cause that number to be that number, right? So I have kind of I have no feedback that allows me to modify my behavior to do that. So one of the things that we've become increasingly interested in is the whole aspect of behavioral components of energy use. Because we've seen time and time again, really super efficient buildings that the energy numbers aren't that great, partially because the behavior in them is so poor. And inefficient buildings where people actually run them really well or behave really well in them, and the energy use looks great. So some of it is a combination of individual behavior, but also, as with fleets, and we also see this in other examples of knowing what your neighbors are doing becomes a really powerful way of getting at driving efficiency and helping create a marketplace for the efficiency.
So are you suggesting that it's really a more of a cultural issue? I mean, in terms of understanding how you're not necessarily compared to somebody else, but also that there's a culture of wanting to do something together, so that drives the type of behaviors collectively?
Some of it, yeah. It's some of it going, oh, my neighbor, where do I stack up in my neighborhood? Oh, I don't get the smiley face on my bill.
Let me jump to something here, because Ariella, you dealt with this in a way where cities are competing with each other, right? I mean, and I think Plan YC in many ways started to establish a roadmap. Well, maybe a little bit borrowing from London, but starting a roadmap for actually looking at larger scale city energy plans. Can you comment on that? And this issue of maybe competitive nature or cultural issue in reducing energy demand.
I was debating whether I was going to pull a bill and then start answering that question. I'm picturing my National Grid bill, which did show that this past month I did worse than my neighbors, and it's driving me crazy. But anyway, I will answer your question. Competition among cities does play a great role, but there's, the policy, and you could say anything in terms of setting goals and recommendations and setting policies, and doesn't necessarily mean they're as effective. So when we're thinking of policies and regulations, we have to think of it on a few different scales. There's, setting the goal. You could do the analysis and think you figure out some of the drivers and come up with the policy you think is right. But then there's the perspective of actually having to implement it, and then feeling the personal effects to it. So I'm going to focus on the first and then get to the other two a little bit. No, cities are competitive. What was great when Plan YC came out, and I should say one of the drivers of getting Plan YC out when it was coming out was because the C40 cities, which at the time was the C20, it was a combination of the largest cities in the world, were going to come together on a climate change conference, and it was decided in 2005 that in 2007 it was going to be in New York City, and there was a little bit of a, okay, we have to make sure we have something to say, so that competitive drive was definitely already there. So come out with Plan YC, there's a big celebratory party in April 2007. I'm talking to someone from Chicago who's pretty much my counterpart, and he goes, shoot, we came out with our environmental plan in 2005, and now we have to go out and write another plan because of this. And so that competition is definitely helpful, with Chicago saying we're the greenest city, and New York trying to make the case with numbers, well, look at the indicators, we're greener. But at the end of the day, what really happened on the ground is what makes the difference. And it really is hard to move the needle.
In what way? I mean, in the needle on energy efficiency across the building portfolio, or energy efficiency of just an overall city?
Sure, of both. Of both, and we can do the perspective from the greater policy, and I can also give the perspective from someone who's responsible for the portfolio for a while. So on the larger thing, you have to be it is so important not to just focus on one thing. So, you can't just focus on the codes. You have to look at, as you were saying, the infrastructure, the delivery. You have to look at the supply side. Well, when you start looking at all these components that come together, which all aspects of energy consumption, energy use need to be considered in order to really make those larger goals, you start getting into some of the challenge. Who regulates what? Who has the law? Who has the authority? Who's making the decision? How will that be enforced? So there's many different components to it. Moving the needle isn't that easy. But it gets, in some ways, simpler when you're looking at it from portfolio perspective, because you're the decision maker. You have the money. You can just do it on your own. But what's been interesting in playing that role at DCAS, where, okay, I have the money, I have some have the contracts, I have the mandate to do this, is energy efficiency, even with the best intentions and really smart people, is not always that easy to do, especially on a portfolio level. Because we're not just talking about little maintenance projects, although operations maintenance is a huge component of it in itself is very complicated and has many different parts to it. But we're not just going out and screwing out and changing light bulbs. I mean, we're talking about significant construction projects that need to be respected as construction projects, that things go wrong, things happen, they take time, they take, analysis, feasibility, there's construction, there's checking it after. So there's a lot that goes into energy efficiency, and I think it's very easy for policy people when they're first setting these goals and regulations to just say, oh, well, we'll just require this. Oh, they'll just do that, or why don't they just do that? And it's not until you actually implement that you see it's actually not always that easy. We try to make the case, it's not so hard, the economics work, you could do this, there's this incentive, but when you actually do it, it's not that easy. And then now as a personal homeowner, getting to your point, you definitely feel it that much more.
So I want to build on that a little bit, because looping back to your question to me about, okay, so the term is cream skimming, right? And you'll see cream skimming. Uh-huh. They'll come in and we'll change the lights, or we'll give you higher efficiency drive systems on your motors and all of that. You'll capture a little bit of savings here and there, but you put those together and you miss some of the bigger, deeper opportunities. And so we kind of asked, we did a dive, and with our sister firm, Cook Fox, we sort of asked, okay, here it is, the recession. We've done deep retrofits of buildings before. Let's have conversations and see if we can get people to do that. And what we discovered was, unless I can do it within the context of repositioning a building, of taking a B and turning it into, taking a C building and turning it into a B, where I can recapture it through the rent and re-tenant the building and pay for all that headache and all that process. Just doing it on the energy savings alone, the owners were thoroughly uninterested because they couldn't recapture it, and even more, what we're finding was really hard for them to finance it. If they could do it in the context of repositioning a building, then it became it became part of the process of thinking about repositioning.
I'll jump ahead a little bit on that, but that simply speaks to the price of energy, doesn't it? It speaks to the price of energy that it's not, pushing in a market-driven way. It's not pushing the envelope. I mean, the cream skimming is such that when you start to get deeper down, you're struggling because, let's face it, energy is a utility. I mean, most energy rates are regulated. So, and energy is still extremely cheap in the United States, at least. And in many areas of the United States where it's driven by, hydroelectric or other kinds of areas, it's actually quite cheap. So we are forced sometimes with this economic quandary because we know we need to save energy because energy is relating to other problems, but if you just look at it on an economic basis, you're struggling.
Well, if you look at a typical office building, all right, the cost of an office building on an annual basis, energy is like 1% of the cost of occupancy. 9% is the rent, the rest is the people, right? So taking technologies like the glazing technologies and the stuff that improve the comfort of the people and improve the daylight transmissions and stuff that Stephen's been working on for so long, that's where you get the difference, right? If I can make the people happier, healthier, more productive, that swamps all the energy savings. The energy savings is sort of like a benefit that comes along with that.
Mm-hmm.
When I can get into that, it changes the equation. It really changes the equation because the energy use is like 1% of that total occupancy.
So
Stephen?
one of the challenges is how much do you want to save? I'm going to come at this a slightly different way. How much do you want to save? If your goal is 5 or 10% savings, then there's lots of stuff you can do. So for example, the gaming that Bill was talking about, there's some studies out there that show that if you put meters in kitchens of homes, then on average people will reduce, it's the Prius effect, people will reduce their consumption by 5% or so. And some of it, if you take the meters away or you don't keep sort of flashing stuff at them, it drops down. So if your goal is 5%, then there's good strategies. If your goal is 50%, plus or minus 50%, which it ought to be if we're going to really solve the carbon problem and the energy problem, that stuff isn't going to work. And my view is pricing isn't going to work because it goes back to coming out maybe for about gasoline, that you could make it work, but if you raise the price high enough to make it work, all hell would break loose. I mean, some of you don't remember, maybe the vinyl guys do, but Carter proposed to add 5 cents a gallon to a tax on gasoline, and he was blown out of the water by it. And Obama hasn't done much better in terms of that kind of stuff. So that's a minefield to kind of go down. So I think price matters, and it's important to send the right kinds of price signals. And for example, on the grid side, peak pricing of electricity, which California has, is important. It discourages use in the hot few hours in the afternoon, and load shifting and shedding and storage and architectural strategies that do that can be driven by that. But if you're pushing, going back to my comment, if you're pushing for big savings, 50, 60, 70%, then I think you have to think outside the box in terms of what to do. And again, there's not going to be, we'd say there's no silver bullet here. There's a shotgun approach here, right? Where you need to think about technology, design tools, education and practice, financing, and in any given building, in any given project, one or another of those might be the drivers or the roadblock, but it's a little bit, it's hard to generalize and say, yeah, it's price, or yeah, it's technology, or yeah, it's this or that. It's some complicated combination of all of those, and they all help. And I think what the country needs and hasn't had is a consistent message that, A, it matters, and B, there's something you can do about it, and C, here are the things you can do, and probably a bunch of other things like that as well.
So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of this balance. I mean, because let's start with the premise that there is an underlying problem about just simply using energy like it's air, all right? And if that is the thesis here, how do you then motivate? Do you motivate by market-driven force? Do you motivate by regulatory, screws? So and to me, I think that balance, is always very interesting. I mean, we work around the globe, and it's very interesting to see how that balance is shifted from various country to country, and how it's shifted in terms of countries that have a lot of oil or a lot of natural gas or a lot of coal, because their policies are all very specifically selected around those issues. So I maybe Bill, if you want to comment on that.
I'm not sure where to start on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by, we did a bunch of work in Puerto Rico. They're paying 28 cents a kilowatt hour there, right? If our utility rates here in this city were 28 cents a kilowatt hour, we'd have a revolution on our hands, right? And there, efficiency, we saw little next to nothing there, right? Hawaii's much the same way. They can have similarly high or even higher utility rates and the level of efficiency performance of that. And then I flip it around and I look at Seattle, which is on old hydro and all of that, that has some of the cheapest utility rates in the country, and yet has some of the best performance in terms of buildings and stuff that people are doing. And so some of it has to do with regulatory culture, some of it has to do with sort of establishing services and tradition in how we build and think about how we build and design.
So you don't see such a strict correlation, I mean, from your examples?
I don't see a price correlation quite as much. Some of it has to do with building culture and the education in the building industry, where in the Pacific Northwest, partially due to some federal labs, partially due to progressive utilities and environmental groups, they got really on top of the issue and said, let's really go out and educate builders. Let's educate the market. Let's get very active in it. And you wind up seeing lots of higher performance buildings in a place where utility costs are relatively low. Right. And in other places like Hawaii, where the utilities have been recalcitrant would be a nice way to describe them. You, until recently, have seen very little. And it's really astonishing in a place that is totally blessed with solar and wind and phenomenal renewable resources.
Ariella, you
we're at a really interesting time right now. I mean, it's awful, the loss that came from Hurricane Sandy and the damage and the impact on folks' life. But there is this unique opportunity to kind of change the conversation around energy efficiency, upgrading our infrastructure, clean distributed generation, and even our supply of energy with this idea of resilience in mind. And my concern is that we're going to miss this special window, because I think the window's already starting to get closed as people are already getting tired of the conversations around resiliency. But what's really interesting is those places that had updated, modern, clean distributed generation, whether it was solar, whether it was cogen or something else, that were smart enough that they were able to island at the appropriate time to provide key services, meaning electric services in key places, hot water and heat in key places, in a limited in a limited amount, so they made sure their buildings were as energy efficient as possible. They fared pretty well. And so as, being an engineering firm, hearing about lots of different projects that are happening on the waterfront, the conversation for people who actually have projects going on right now is starting to change. They're like, well, maybe I do want clean on-site generation. Maybe now cogen makes sense for me. Well, if I'm going to have cogen, well, then maybe I should make sure my building load is a little bit smaller so that I can, without having to have a really big piece of infrastructure, I can be able to provide reliable services. And right now, that's the building level, and then you always have to connect it to the infrastructure, the transmission lines. So at this time, the utilities are under so much pressure. Why weren't they prepared? Why weren't they up to date? Well, folks who've been pushing Con Ed and the Public Service Commission and others for years know the reasons why, right? Con Ed can't make, they're not going to make an investment unless they're able to socialize the cost. They have to go to the Public Service Commission, ask to increase their rates. And similar to the previous examples, every time there's a rate case, everyone freaks out. You can't increase our electricity rates even more. They're some of the highest in the country, if not the highest outside of Hawaii. And so then they get stuck. So how can we upgrade, our entire infrastructure to the 21st century, to the next generation of the grid, if our ratepayers won't allow us? So you have this conundrum going on, but you have this unique opportunity where there's some money that's going to go towards it, although not enough, but there's interest on the federal level to focus on it. You now have the Public Service Commission and utilities under a lot of stress, and there's the hope that maybe ratepayers may be okay with a slight increase if it's in name resiliency. I think for all of this energy conversation, I was talking about the different scales. It's the making it personal to people is where you really get them. And a disaster like Sandy is very personal for people, both people who were impacted and people who watched it and felt helpless. What could we do?
Well, it goes back to the behavioral aspect. I mean, it starts kind of with us. But Stephen, you want to
add? I want to add, just to add to this. So we have interesting rate structures, and this is for water, gas, and electricity. These numbers are about right. First 100 kilowatt hours I use are about 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That's around the national average. The next 100 or so are at 15. Anything above that is at 30 cents a kilowatt hour. It's up in Hawaii levels, really expensive. Now, frankly, if you were to poll Californian ratepayers and say, how many of you know that's really going on? Because in the end, you're looking at an average. But at the margin, you're paying a huge amount. And so the people that pay attention to that do have an incentive to invest in solar or other stuff, maybe just more efficient stuff. The second thing is that California also implemented smart meters. Now, smart meters really aren't smart at all. They're just meters that send out signals. But I can log online. I mean, they don't do anything. They don't make your house work any better. But I can log online and I can look. I think there's about a 12-hour delay. I can look at my electricity use and my gas use. I can check last night and see if my wife left the lights on, for example. And so I've done this. I don't actually. When it first started, not if she left the lights on, but I've done, like, I go away on vacation, and we have a cat, and we have someone who comes in and feeds the cat. I can see that blip for an hour or two in the evening. A couple 100 watts of stuff went on because otherwise the house is cold and dark. So that's an enabling system that people could build on. That's good news. The bad news is when that first came out, Google and Microsoft, people with money and power and smarts, tried to build on that. And Google was going to offer all these services and apps and help you compete on your block and all this good stuff. And they put money into it and advertised it, and it all died. They pulled out after a year or two. And I haven't followed the details of why, but that tells you something about what's going on. Now let me make one more quick comment. I think in general, you want market forces to drive decision-making and investments and all that as a general philosophy. Having said that, I'm arguing the other side of my mouth that in general they don't work well enough because prices don't drive the market enough. But there are areas where the government has been very aggressive and effective, things like appliance standards and automobile fuel efficiency standards. I mean, you cannot build and legally sell a refrigerator that uses more than about $80 a year in electricity. 20 years ago, they used $300 a year. So we've had an amazing success level, $50 to $100 billion worth of savings, and the law that mandated all that says that so they're going to end up forcing you to buy a more costly refrigerator with all this good stuff in it, but it's going to save you money over the life cycle. And the way the law is written is that as long as your life cycle savings are more than the extra cost of the refrigerator, it's quote, legal to do it. And that got passed during the Reagan administration, by the way. So that particular piece, something that's narrow and well-defined like a washing machine and refrigerator, has been successful, has saved a lot of energy and money. And I don't know how it fits into the behavior issue, but so there's a strategy that works. But I don't think you can extrapolate that to integrated building systems.
Right.
You're way in a whole other world.
Right. Well, let me ask the question then in a different way. How are some of these give some examples of where regulatory areas are, shall we say, weak, and maybe need to be pushed forward? Just curious of an example that you can think that's something that the market is really not catching on right now. I mean, again, we're coming from the thesis that we're not treating energy like it's free and just air. I mean, because if you do come from that thesis, then all this is quite frankly BS. It doesn't matter. We might as well go back to riding in 72 Caddies or Hummers. So I think I always have to kind of keep that grounding here. But let's just give me an example from what you think. I mean, Ariella, I'll point this one to you, of where you think maybe the regulatory areas are not enough to really promote that market.
So I'm going to answer where I thought you were going until the very end. But, I think it goes back to the question of drivers, which was the first question of the evening. And I keep thinking of an example that came from a building management company here in New York City, where a lot of the companies that they wanted to attract, law firms and other high-end type companies, were trying to hire the best and brightest young people to be at their firm. And those best and brightest were the ones demanding questions like, is your building LEED certified? Are you energy efficient? Do you care about sustainability principles? And so these law firms and other similar firms, to attract these best and brightest, were then looking for those places that had that advantage. It was a market advantage. So you see not a lot, you see Class A buildings, commercial buildings I'm talking about right now, in New York City have taken the lead towards energy efficiency before the regulation was there. A lot of them have already done the energy audits and have invested in high systems, not market-driven because of the cost of energy, market-driven as a competitive advantage to attract the top firms. So it helps on that end. What it doesn't help with is you have the Class B, Class C, and other buildings that may have less sophisticated owners or just don't have the resources, where even if the economics didn't make sense for them, they might not be able to get the financing. It's really confusing, all the incentives and programs and who does what and how to do it. And they're just trying to, masking tape or whatever, keep that building running, because as long as people are comfortable and aren't complaining they're too hot and too cold, they're considered successful. So there's the drivers on the market side, which aren't necessarily the cost. And then the regulations come in to kind of help bring up the bottom. But the regulations have to be in concert, in parallel with programs that could be supportive. So for example, for the Greener Greater Building Plan for New York, a lot of the Class A buildings already did the benchmarking, the energy audits, the retrofits. It really was to help the bottom performers. But just having the rule doesn't mean they're going to do it. So there was the creation of the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation to help bring financing to the table. There's the goal, although I don't think anyone's achieved it yet, to make this one-stop shop, that's the term everyone uses, to make it less confusing to figure out how to move forward. Mm-hmm. So there's putting in place the support to really help bring the bottom up, and I think that's where government and regulation comes in. Because to quote the president last night, it's not that we need bigger government or more regulations, it's smarter. The refrigerator being a performance standard, you could say, was a smarter type of goal, and we just need to make sure we're being smart about how we bring the bottom up.
Bill, you want to comment?
One of the regulatory pieces that's intriguing for me is the revolution that's happening, particularly on the energy side of electricity, has been microgeneration. The amount of capacity that it's added all over the world over the last 10 years hasn't been big power plants. The vast majority has been very small microgeneration. A lot of it being cogen systems in buildings. A lot of it being small-scale application of solar and renewables and all of that. And yet when you look at trying to do that across the United States, every jurisdiction, every utility has completely different standards on how you do that. There's no sort of universal interconnect standard. There's, if you think about it, if it'd be like every different, like it used to be, every different piece of software had different standards, so I couldn't take my Word document here and send it to you and you'd be able to use it because your software is different. And we still see that on the utility regulatory side, is that every state, every municipality, every utility has a completely different set of standards on how you interconnect stuff. And so increasingly the cost of trying to do these systems isn't the technology and the installation. It's more and more, it's trying to get through the paperwork and trying to get that interconnect in there.
So that's interesting. So you see that as a real blockade to, other types of energy sources or on-site.
Yeah. And, we, our sister firm designed the Bank of America Tower. And it has a 4.7 megawatt gas turbine in it. And we fought with Con Ed, and we fought with Con Ed, and we fought with Con Ed to try and get this thing to have the capability of the grid went down, this building could island, right? It's a pretty, it's got data centers and trading floors, so it's a large energy user, but the building itself is inherently pretty efficient. Well, it's tied to the substation on 34th Street. So even though it's north of 34th, when Sandy rolls in, the grid went down, that building went offline. That building was dark, right? Because by the time that Con Ed finally agreed to allow the building to island, it was so far into the construction process, couldn't get the switchgear in to allow the building to island. So here's this building that could have been up and running boom, down, right? Crazy. And so I'm hoping that one thing about Sandy is hopefully this conversation about islanding and microgeneration and all of that. The military is pushing very hard on this. Because, and not from an environmental or cost standpoint. They see it entirely as a national security and continuity issue. There's
I'm sorry. I just sorry to cut you off because I want to get to questions, but I wanted one final piece. I'd like to get some input from you guys. I think this issue of resiliency is fascinating because I think it is changing right now. This idea of climate change. I mean, this idea of climate change as being a very incredibly intractable and difficult problem to solve globally, to really the issues of climate change in terms of the disruption in our daily lives, in terms of resiliency, is having a very personal impact on everybody, especially in New York. How do you see this playing out over the next 4 years? I know this is a tough question, but I mean, the political will in municipal terms in New York is certainly there at the moment. State and federal and city are aligned on something like, quite frankly, never before. Not for a long time. I'm just curious of your input on this, and then I think we'll open it up to general questions from the audience.
Well, let me make one comment, because as far as climate change goes, first of all, I hope you all understand that there is no real scientific debate about the big picture issues of climate change. If you watch the wrong channels on TV, you'll think this is, it could be this, it could be that. The details are unclear, and any good scientist will tell you there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's no question that the climate is changing. There's no question that humans have an impact. And so most of that stuff at the 99% level, if you talk to people who make a living doing this and who understand the science and so on, they all agree. Now, that doesn't mean, that's just to eliminate some of the noise out there. There are real questions, though, about how to react to it, how to solve it, what to do about it, and all that. Those are messy, complicated questions that have political, economic, and all kinds of other aspects to them. But I think the resilient. So there's a part of me. Watched the snowstorm last week from a distance, and I watched the flood from a distance. I think it's too bad in some ways that it takes those kinds of events to wake people up and get them thinking. The pragmatic part of me says whatever works, works. And so if the cumulative effect of those things is having the desired effect that people are beginning for the first time to pay more attention to it, then that's the way it is, and let's move forward. So what's the expression? A disaster is a terrible thing to waste, or something like that. I forget who said that, but if rational thinking won't get you where you want to go, and you're convinced that we need to get there, then you use whatever mechanism you need. Now, let me just throw in one more piece, that you still have to be careful about how you respond. And I want to bring up the islanding thing and the grid thing. This is a pretty complicated issue. The utilities, I agree with all of those comments, but the utilities do have a concern, and that is that if everybody, or a lot of folks, do their own little 5 megawatt deals on their buildings, and they use them for their normal their normal operations, which some of them are doing, but in a pinch, on a hot summer afternoon, they turn to Con Ed or the grid or wherever you are for their power. That's an unsustainable solution for the central utility. So what has to happen is people have to sort this out. What you want is a diverse, integrated, coherent system, but the mix and match of centralized versus decentralized and who pays for what and how and when and all that really needs to be sorted out. If it's left, this is one where it's left to the free market, it might not work at all. The utilities worry about what they call a death spiral, that the good customers go offline with their own little systems, and that means that the background costs that have to be sustained to keep the grid operating then have to be paid by a smaller and smaller number of subscribers. The rates go up, more people go offline, and so on, and that's the death spiral. So that's a relatively messy, complicated problem, but it's certainly solvable if someone decides that they want to do it.
Let me just to focus on this carbon thing. Let's just say, in a world where carbon's priced, whether it's 4 years, 10 years, 2 years, now, give me an idea from your perspective what changes we would see in the building industry in the United States. I'll let you go, Ariella, and then Bill, you'll finish this off here.
I guess it depends at what rate it's priced at. The devil's in the details, right? So if you look at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here and
A
here,
significant rate.
right? Because what we've seen,
Enough
just
to
for
hurt.
those who don't know, we have a program in the Northeast. Well, it was 10 states, now 9 states, and the prices are so low that it's actually a throwaway
Right.
in some ways. But it can do a few things, and actually it can be very exciting, except for the impact it may have on, as you said, the fraction of the population where, hitting your energy costs and paying for them is a burden. It can do a few things. You start leveling the playing field of energy costs. So you have, coal costs a certain amount, renewable energy, you're starting to level the playing field on one hand, number one. But so that's always exciting when the price signals start to make sense, number one. Number two, you're starting to take all those externalities of air quality and climate change, and you're starting to internalize those into the price, and that's reflected. And that's always a healthy thing to do when you're actually paying for the real cost of something. But number three, which is not the normal trajectory on pricing, I think it'd be exciting what the utilities start doing. In that right now, they have their centralized system, whether it's a regulated or deregulated market. For the most part, you have, a few big power plants that are being transmitted, and that's where you're getting most people's energy. Most people are getting energy from, for the most part. I think with the right price signals and the right scheme, and the responsibility really going to the utilities and the grid managers the way it's supposed to, you're going to start seeing these utilities investing in the clean distributed generation. So instead of having to fight with them for interconnection, they're going to do it. They're going to say, it's in my best interest to maximize every place where we can put solar in a city and connect it to my grid where it works for me. And I want clean DG. This substation, it could really use a boost or something, so I'm going to put a 25 megawatt little plant right there, or a micro something right here. And I think when utilities start to have to take ownership of the impacts of the of a cap and trade system, I think we'll see really interesting things happen. I think that's how we really move the market in a bigger way.
So, Bill, to us mere mortals in architecture, how carbon priced significantly, not as a throwaway, how does that, in terms of building technologies, architectural forms, do you see? Is it the type of thing, do you think, will have an impact on the way buildings are planned? Or is this just simply, another version of Battery Park City that kind of looks kind of the way that we did things before?
There's a building for me that's really instructive. It's a building that was done for the National Renewable Energy Lab. And it's currently the biggest net zero energy building in the country. And that building was, for me, really instructive, because what they pulled off there was, rather than going really fancy, they went back and did a largely passive building. It's day-lit. It's naturally ventilated. Now, it's also in a very easy climate, but they really focused on the fundamentals of design from energy and a light and a thermal comfort standpoint. And that's how they pulled it off. And what was really intriguing was it was a project that was done on one of the weirdest contract mechanisms I've ever seen. It was absolutely brilliant. Here's what the cost of the building will be. You have this much money. That's it. And the building has to meet this level of energy performance per square foot. And it needs to house this number of people. Go to it. That was what they were given.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a penny more to spend, and so they had to get really, really creative. And what they discovered was the best way to do that was really go back to fundamental design principles and say, first and foremost, even though this is a large office building, we're going to look at ideas of passive design, daylighting, natural ventilation, that the building itself, the thermal envelope and the mass of the building are part of the equation, right? It's not all these techno fixes. It was really going back to the fundamentals of design.
So I mean, so the corollary here is, if there was enough of a realistic price point to force that type of an approach, that might be a tipping point for the way a building is designed. That's what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
So let me be disruptive and
You're
argue
gonna be realist here,
against it. Well,
Stephen?
no, I would make two simple comments. One is that what Bill just talked about, that building should be done anywhere, all the time, anyway, independent of energy price and carbon and all that. The second comment, which I think is more challenging, is let's do the thought experiment. How much do you think carbon is going to raise the price of energy? Do you think it's going to raise it 20%, 50%, 100%? I mean, pick a number. Let's say 50%. That's probably not acceptable socially, but 50%. So then the thought experiment is look around the country. The variation in energy price now, today, is like 500%. Northwest is 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. I'm paying 15 or 20. The Northeast paying whatever. So ask the question, is there a significant difference in the way architects design buildings around the country? Can you find a correlation between the efficiency of buildings by region based on price of energy, which is a 5-to-1 variation? I don't believe you can, and if that's the case, then why would we ever assume that jacking up the price in any one place is instantly going to change the way you guys design buildings? Sorry for the bad news, but that's my quick take on that. Which isn't to say, what I would do though, just so as to end on a positive note, you should do it. You should collect that money, whatever it is, it'll be billions of dollars, and invest it wisely in all kinds of good things, training architects, doing better disclosure on buildings, new regulations, new tools. There's 1,000 things you could do and invest it wisely. But the extra cost of it, I don't think is going to magically drive better design.
Interesting. Okay. Very, very, very interesting, and not something I did not. Not to say I don't expect you to come out with things from left field, but that was quite interesting. So anyway, I think it's important to get some dialogue going here. It's such a broad question. We've covered a lot of territory here. I have a dozen questions left, but I'm going to leave them. So first question here.
I was wondering, as an architect, an architectural school and all, they've had here different lecturers who have spoken about the planning of, where does the architect come into view in this whole thing? Because eliminating half the automobiles in the United States and producing really train systems would solve just about every energy problem there is right now. But that isn't done overnight. Putting buildings together instead of individual houses or individual buildings also saves 50% probably in energy. So is it really energy is of course a big question, but the whole planning issue that an architect should be into is really the issue, I believe, where he can take a big broad view of the whole thing and propose these different things, in that manner. Enclosing a whole building in construction with reflective items to pick up for solar and wind and so forth, and therefore becomes an architecture there, or just the planning where all these parts are within cities and plans and all. I mean, the transportation systems is of ultimate importance, and the efficiency of it. I understand that New York City is probably the most efficient city in the United States as far as people and how much energy they use and so forth because of the compactness of it. So I was wondering, that planning issue that architects hopefully will get more and more into is important. Maybe
Bill?
Richard Florida wrote this amazing book that hasn't gotten a lot of press attention. It came out about a year ago, called The Great Reset. And in it, and Richard Florida is the guy who wrote about the creative class and the rise of rediscovery of cities. And he says, what's really interesting is if you look at great economic downturns like we went through, and he said, he went back and he looked at the two last big ones, which would be the Great Depression, and before that, in the 1880s, what is now being called by economists Long Depression. And in each case, it takes about 20 years for the economy to come back after that, to really get fully restored after those events. And what happens after, in both of those cases, is you also had a complete shift in where people were living. At the end of the Long Depression, you had people moving off the farms, moving to the cities. At the end of the Great Depression, you had people moving out of the cities into the suburbs. The pattern that's starting to be seen, and Chris Leinberger is an economist, teaches at GW and also works for Brookings, has been looking at, in particular, looking at what happened in the DC market. I live in, my home is in Washington, DC, and I live downtown, and I'm observing this in my own neighborhood. Prior to the recession, the most expensive real estate by far was the big houses out along the Potomac River, out in the far suburbs. Collapse of the market, downtown, the local area dropped 23% of its value. Boom, crash. And now, as the market has turned, and you look at DC, the indicator that will tell you what the most expensive real estate is the walk score of the neighborhood. That's the strongest correlation of price point in the DC market now, is the walk score. So those big homes have cratered in value out in the suburbs, and it hasn't come back. But neighborhoods like where I live in DuPont Circle, which has a walk score, I think, of 97, the prices are going through the roof. It's crazy. And it's not just in downtown, but any place out in the suburbs as well. The new urbanist projects that are by transit and all that, the same thing is happening. And so what Florida is saying, and what some of these other land economists are saying, is that watch over the next 20 years, you're going to see this shift back to the cities, and it's happening actually quicker than Florida and others said that they thought that it would happen.
Let's take another question. Up front?
What you've said about about the price of energy not being correlated to the per capita consumption. And that's kind of interesting, and Bill touched on it when he talked about Seattle, and Steve talked about it as well. And you look at Japan, which even before the tsunami, forget about the nuclear power problem, their per capita consumption was much less than ours. Their standard of living was the same. You look at the Netherlands, their per capita consumption was much less than ours. Their standard of living was the same. I used to say to myself it was because energy was so expensive there. Can you think of what the cultural things are? If it's not energy, if it's not the price of energy, that's causing those changes, what are those cultural things that cause people to live so much more conservatively on an energy budget, and how can we implement those things here?
Well, this is somewhat, I think there's some good studies of these things, which I haven't read, but I know little bits and pieces of, so let me speculate. First of all, long-term signals. These things, the results you see there are the result of policy that's been in place for, say, 50 years since the war, since the Second World War. And the governments, by and large, have paid attention to energy. It's been important and so on, which we haven't, at best, we've had ups and downs in this country, and generally have no policy at all. So that might argue that, yes, over 50 years you can make a difference as generations adapt and so on and so forth. The second thing is, and again, this is outside my world, but from an urban planning point of view, Europe and Japan are much denser. The issues of all the issues we just talked about before are very different than New Mexico and Los Angeles and all the distributed urban, suburban stuff that we have. So you have to, as Bill was saying, you have to unwind 50 years or 130 years or whatever it is of practice, I think, to make that work. And then they have, really strong price signals. Like in some of the Scandinavian countries, you pay 50% taxes to buy a new car. And they've decided to make these prices really painful. At the same time, they pay a little bit of attention to social equity. They don't have as stratified a population as we have in for those that aren't as well off, they take care of them. So they pay a big penalty for energy, and they take care of the people who will be hurt by it. And in theory, you can implement all those things in the U.S. In practice, probably no way. Or at least not in a time frame of a decade or two.
I mean, there's some significant cultural differences as well. I lived in Japan as a kid, and have gone back and spent time with friends. And the Japanese economy, from an energy standpoint, is wildly more efficient than we are. But their savings is largely in industry and in transportation. Because until fairly recently, Japanese buildings were sieves. And your expectation in a Japanese home in the winter was you're going to be wearing lots of layers because it's cold. And if you're in a Japanese school, you're wearing a jacket, right? You're wearing your winter coat and all of that. Now, some of that was a cultural thing about you will be tough. You must be tough, right? But some of it was also the construction and design practices where you really couldn't heat it. A standard Japanese home, keeping it warm was difficult. Now that's changed over the last 20 years, but up until that point, Japanese construction from an energy standpoint, Japanese buildings were horrific.
And the average size of a Japanese home compared to the U.S.?
Yeah, is also much smaller.
In the front.
So earlier there was this comment about gaming, and I wanted to sort of bring up a little bit about behavioral change and consumer behavior. So gaming, leaving into smart meters and playing around on the internet, and building islands, the idea of sort of self-sufficient buildings. So the question is this a system that's more set up for millennials, people in the future generations that are more prone to these kinds of tweaking around, metering things? And then the question is, though, a lot of news reports are commenting on the millennial generation as the cheapest generation. They're not buying cars, they're not buying homes. So trigger is this future energy a trigger waiting to happen in the future because of millennials, or thoughts?
I mean, I'll answer just quickly that we do see that impact in what we're designing currently, very extreme, on an extreme basis, because that generation is really many target generation for many developers now, and the behavior is completely different. I mean, I do think interface to a device is very commonplace. The idea that you can change your environment and adapt to something and it's not static. I mean, these are all issues. In fact, the transient nature of how you work is very different. So we see. I mean, this behavioral issue, or talk to some interior designers. I mean, it's very relevant to the issue of lower energy, type architecture, as it goes forward. So that it's very real from my perspective right now in terms of the forces that we're seeing. But
I'll give you one tiny concrete example. My son, who I guess is millennial, I'm not sure, went out and bought a smart thermostat that he lives in Los Angeles, and he's driving around a lot, and he can turn all that stuff on and off with a smartphone, right? Anytime, anyway. He didn't do a cost-benefit calculation. He didn't do a payback calculation. It was cool and because he could do it, and because a lot of other stuff in his life works that way with a smartphone. So, yeah, if you can focus it on those kinds of things, I think it could make a difference. There's danger there that maybe the next, trend that will come up next week will go the opposite way. It's, be something that consumes lots of energy, and then everyone will go and do that. And so, the technology is there to do a lot of interesting things, and this is a community that uses it and understands it and is comfortable with it. But how it will be used, it's entirely unclear to me how it's going to end up.
Ariella?
Sure. I keep thinking of an example from the time I was at DCAS. I was responsible for the city's building. It's 4,000 buildings. And besides energy efficiency, as I mentioned earlier, operations and maintenance so important. So we wanted to make sure we had the smartest buildings, which to me is smart just means it provides you data so you can make smarter decisions, right? But so we're trying to think, what's the best way to get all the meters that we need into the right type of dashboard that informs not just, the big managers, but also the people on the ground. We had all these things we were looking for. Did a 3-year analysis on all the different technologies and software coming out, because there was a different one every week, and they were all calling, hey, I have a technology that's going to solve everything. So, we're going through these, and while we were doing that 3-year analysis, when we finished and it was ready to figure out how to implement, we realized in those 3 years, it all changed. None of that mattered, because now we have the cloud. So a lot of the challenges in terms of infrastructure that we were trying to figure out all of a sudden weren't relevant, and in some ways starting from scratch. And it was a great example of the fact that we don't know what is out there. And I think part of the bigger challenge that we have in figuring out the energy future is we're stuck thinking within current technologies how we can make them work, current regulatory schemes which we've been fighting to get into place for years and then fix and this and that. The big jump that's needed, a lot of us have really I'll speak for myself, I can't fully picture what that is because it's not out there. And I think if we were able to have a vision of what the future of energy really looks like, it would actually make it easier to get there. So I went on a tangent, but...
Another question here in the middle.
So I'm going to play off that for a second. So when I think of the future of energy, I think of carbon. And if we take a biological lens, our problem is a misallocation of a resource. So how do we get people to think about carbon as an asset? And so instead of trying to get rid of it or trying not to emit it, we're all fighting to capture it and use it for 3D printing or for more energy production or something else. So so my question to the panel is, how do we sort of reframe this whole conversation around the future of energy instead of about minimization or hyper efficiency and reduced standard of living is what some people perceive it as, into greater abundance, more opportunity, greater flexibility. I don't know.
That's a hard one. I'll let you guys answer.
Yeah, nothing.
I just keep thinking about Amory Levin's comment. What's the purpose of coal? The purpose of coal is to hold up the ground so the ground doesn't fall down. Keep it in the ground so it holds up the forest above it. Some of the carbon capture stuff right now is intriguing, and I'm fascinated by some stuff like technologies like algal turf scrubbers and stuff like that are capturing our carbon out of the atmosphere. Not necessarily sequestering it, but saying, okay, it's already in the atmosphere. I'm going to cycle it now several more times as a renewable energy to sort of offset the larger burden. But as we see people trying to do artificial photosynthesis and stuff like that, where you in effect are going to be growing materials and growing energy sources, where you are inherently going to be capturing ambient carbon to do that. That gives me a lot of hope.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think part of your comment was you want to use carbon to make things, right? 3D printers or carbon fibers. Okay, if that part of it, simplest, cheapest way to do that is use other existing carbon sources. What you wouldn't want to do is all these processes which we hope will get developed and pull carbon out of the air, that's going to be expensive. So you may want to pull carbon out of the air, but I think the reason you want to do it is not because you then want to take it and build something from it. At least I think that logic is there. There's a lot of innovative R&D going on, very high-tech R&D, high-risk, high-tech R&D, nanotechnology molecules that can magically do this. All the stuff being sort of looked at scale now is very costly, very complicated, very costly, very energy intensive itself. And I haven't seen anything after a decade or two that looks like it's a clear winner. The only thing that's a clear winner is energy efficiency. I mean, don't emit the damn stuff. Maybe that's a little too simple, but But, you know, if I were a betting man and said, what do you want to do in the next 10 to 20 years, I'd invest in R&D to see whether some bright scientist will figure out a way to do that carbon capture cheaply. But at the moment, it's not looking all that good. And so I would say the thing we know how to do is build buildings better. And we should do that as aggressively as possible. And the other things as well, the automobile things and things like that. We know how to make 50, 60 mile per gallon cars, and so the legislation's in place now to do that. So we've started up that pathway.
And I think I want to build on that. It's pretty interesting to me. I mean, crowded roads, polluted cities, inefficient, ways of recycling waste. These processes have been designed, implemented through policy, through design, through engineering, through urban planning. I mean, we've designed ourselves into some pretty awful situations, and it still happens, around the world. I mean, that does give me some hope that we can also help ourselves design out, with the right types of incentives and the right types of, viewpoint going forward. So just to put that in there. Any other questions? In the middle? Do you want to text it instead? Is that right? Because we're tweeting, and all that kind of stuff.
I wanted to know with the design strategy, how it's different in an urban environment such as New York versus a rural environment, because wind turbines aren't as viable of an option. Ground source heat pump, because of subways, isn't as viable of an option. Passive high rises aren't as viable of an option, and how is that design strategy different? And then kind of the second part of my question is, as a millennial, we're a generation that cares very much about these things, and how early do you think this should be integrated into our education, into our design strategy, like within a project or within the entirety of our education, so that we have the enthusiasm, but maybe we don't have the knowledge yet?
I'm going to challenge your assumption about you can't do passive high-rises. I'm going to challenge your assumption about you can't do geothermal, because we're seeing those happen in the city. We see buildings that are doing that. You just have to think more creatively about it, and because we're in smaller spaces, because we've got shared walls, because we've got multiple floors stacked on top of each other, so we have forms and buildings that are more efficient than buildings sitting out in the countryside where all the walls and the roof and everything is totally exposed. It's sort of a different place to start. So yeah, the strategies might be a little different, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be exploring how passive can we make a building sitting in the middle of Manhattan or in the middle of Brooklyn or in the middle of the Bronx. I think there are real opportunities, and one of the shifts that modeling has gotten a lot better, and we can explore a lot more than we used to be able to. We can, the simulations are getting more accurate, and so we can kind of predict a little bit more in advance how they might perform.
I would answer your question on education. I don't think it should be something that you take a course on how to be green. I think it needs to be integrated from day one. I just the way that, my son is 8 years old and plays Minecraft. Does anybody know Minecraft? It's an amazing kind of open source 3D game where he just builds in 3D, with his friends online. And he just knows how to build in 3D now. I mean, I remark on that because, we do all of our work in 3D. And, at some point a couple of years ago, we were arguing whether we should go from 2D to 3D. I mean, those decisions were made by, a long time ago. And I think it's the same thing with the problems that we're talking about here. This is not an issue that is one course or even two courses, green 1 and green 2. It should be something that is really, quite frankly, part of your palette. I mean, as important as history, as important, as learning the design process and critique and iterative notions of design improvement. It's critical. And I actually say, I go further and say that I am often disappointed in the architects that we work with. They don't push us far enough. You know, it drives me nuts when, you know, they say, "Oh, you're an engineer now, you push me." I'm like, I mean, in a way, we're looking for that type of spark, you know, that type, and architects own that space. It really is an important space for architects and architecture students, because change is not going to come, you know, only, you know, from a developer who wants to do net zero building. Although it's great to have a great client, it's going to come from that passion that's developed in schools.
Can I add to this education thing? You know, working in the energy field, I often feel, I talked at the beginning when I answered my first question about frustrations and how hard things are. So I feel the need to be inspired often. And two of the most inspiring professional moments I've had both took place in New York City public schools. And one was at an event that Solar One had put together. It was a big celebration, and everyone there had it was 8th grade, and as part of the science curriculum, they did a whole section on clean energy. And it started in 10 schools and expanded 30-something schools. And the person who heads up that program gave some statistic that when he first walked into the room and started the program, asked how many people have heard of climate change, how many people turn off their lights, and there's maybe 1 or 2 hands. And then in that room at that day, he said, "How many of you know what climate change is?" And everyone raised their hand. How many of you know ways to deal with climate change and reduce energy? And various students would raise their hands and answer the questions. They're right on, you know, turn off the lights, obvious things, you know, walk to the store. So that was inspiring. And then, of course, we brought them all to the boiler room, and they got to see the boiler open up. And that was pretty great, seeing them fully appreciate what's in the belly of the beast, something that most people have no idea what's warming their building. And there they got to see it and comprehend, oh, my God, that big thing is running full blast to keep us warm. So that was one. Then number 2 was the Department of Education participated in something called the Green Cup Challenge, and they were giving the award to the winning school, which in a month reduced its electricity consumption the most. And it was a school in Manhattan that's mostly for immigrant children who are, in particular, refugees. And as part of this, they had to come up with their own technologies and ideas on how to, you know, clean the environment, specifically around energy. And a dozen of them who were on the winning team started talking about what they're doing. So here are people who just came to this country. I get the chills just talking about it for new opportunities, and they were there presenting to. Dennis Walcott, the head of the Department of Education, head of Con Ed, and a few others on what they could do for energy efficiency. So I actually think it's the students who are bringing the inspiration and are going to be able to teach in the other direction.
I want to reinforce that I think, in fact, you should be doing that at grade school. So by the time you enter architecture school, you have a good scientific background and understanding, so you can understand the issues and rationally debate them and then build on all of that. As a national lab, we have programs with the Berkeley school system, the Oakland school system, and we're in grade schools teaching kids, cool roof stuff and getting them out to measure stuff and touch and feel it and make it real and tangible to them, get them excited about it. And I think that's real important. And then if you do that and you do it well for a decade or so, the entering class in architecture school, it won't be an issue. You'll want to do it, you'll demand it of your teachers, you'll demand it of the curriculum, the problem will solve itself.
One other thing I'm going to suggest is I'm really inspired by some of the older buildings in the city. Right? We did some work in the Empire State Building, and it was naturally ventilated. When it was first built, the ventilation system was you open the windows and there were scoops to direct the air, the airflow through the space. It's thin profiles. It was a day-lit, naturally ventilated building. The only central energy system in that building was the radiators, right? And, the expectation about air conditioning has come in, but we're now seeing raised floors and displacement ventilation in that building. But just, sort of playing around and looking at that building going, oh, okay, so they didn't have these crutches that we have now of fans and huge mechanical ventilation systems at the time some of these things were done. And so how did they make it work? We got to work on Stephen was involved in this, the old executive office building, which is a 600,000 square foot granite building sitting next to the White House. And doing work on it, and there were all these sort of weird chambers in the walls, and there were these weird glazed spaces above the skylights in the stairwells, and the domes on the top of the stairwells had stained glass in them, but were missing rows of glass. And it wasn't until we'd been working on the building for a number of months that we actually discovered in Alfred Mullett, the architect's description of the building, his description of the ventilation system of the building. And it was a passively designed building with this really brilliant passive ventilation system that was driven by these cupolas over the top of the building, where you got heat buildup of like 120 degrees in there, vents opened up, and it pulled air all the way through the whole mass of the building. So going back and looking at these buildings, there's an era in the UK and in the US in the late 1880s when they discovered carbon dioxide, and this was the first huge indoor air quality crisis. What are we going to do to get this toxic stuff out of buildings? And so you see these amazing passive or passive hybrid systems that were designed at that time to think about how you moved air through buildings. And then Mr. Carrier came along and we got lazy.
We got lazy, yes. Let's see, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So, Ted, you want to?
So to your point about smart design, I would ask the panel, perhaps Stephen, why we have not leveraged tools, energy models, software. You know, the car industry came up with miles per gallon, and it's a very simple metric that drives behavior. And we have the tools, we have the digital tools to model energy consumption prospectively. But amongst this vast AEC community, there's not a standard. I've got a better way of doing it. My sauce is a special sauce. And we have such phenomenal big data capabilities, and yet we can't seem to agree on what is the minimum standard for building energy consumption. I mean, I'm in the building envelope world, and I can't tell you the last time I saw a building with operable windows that would take advantage of mixed mode. That's a very natural design element, and yet Mr. Courier has killed the goose. Why don't we have advanced thinking in energy modeling in our industry today?
So I think you had two different important ideas there. One is the modeling part, and then the other is maybe the metrics that we use, and the two are somewhat related. This is an area we do a lot of work in. Our lab and others have developed I'll call it the first generation tool. It was called DOE2, which was used as the engine in a lot of other public and private tools, and that's probably still the most widely used tool out there. It comes in different flavors and shapes. The next generation tool that's been under development for a decade or more and is beginning to be widely used, called Energy Plus. So I think those really are de facto standards to some extent. I mean, California is basing all its new codes and standards on it, ASHRAE and others as well. So the engines are there. They're not perfect. They're always being improved and enhanced, but the engines are there. There are issues of interfaces, and the tools, those engines aren't particularly usable and useful by mere mortals without interfaces around them. There's a chicken and egg there. The DOE assumption was that, if you build it, they will come, that you create the engines, you make them publicly available, and firms will rush to invest and build interfaces and then sell them and make money. Well, that hasn't happened because of the nature, it hasn't happened as much as it should have, I should say, partly because of just the nature of how the profession, architects and engineers, either use or don't use or value or don't value tools. And this is an ongoing issue and discussion. There are some private sector things going on. There's a public sector effort to build a new interface to Energy Plus. There's a variety of standalone tools that build on all that. So yeah, there's an ecosystem of tools out there that I think Bill said before are pretty good and pretty useful. In our earlier session today, I quoted someone else saying that, you know, all tools are wrong, but some are useful. And so the challenge is to find the ones that are a good match to the problem you're trying to solve. The corollary to all that is, can you predict in the design phase, can you predict the performance of what will then be occupied 2 or 3 or 4 years later? And the answer is, with some skill and some luck, the tools are fundamentally good enough to do that, but the input data often isn't there. The operating assumptions often aren't done well. There's a whole bunch of issues like that. I think there's a lot to be done there. The New York disclosure law, which is saying to people, what did you actually use, is forcing people to go back and say, what was that stuff we calculated a couple of years ago? Why aren't the numbers we're measuring now correlating back to what we saw before? So I think it's a really important area, and it's an area that's central to the A&E community. It needs a lot of help and a lot of work, but there is a foundation on which to build.
And in terms of the metrics, it is true that there's a lot of different ones. We're starting to see the US EPA portfolio manager for benchmarking is becoming the de facto benchmarking. The problem is it's not as simple as the gauge on your car. You know, on your car, the driver, it's normally his or her car, the gauge is right there in front of you, and it's just measuring one thing. And of course, there's so many more variables that go into an energy benchmark. And even though for some building types you could get a score, not only is that score more complicated and gameable and open to interpretation, but also is meaningless to most people in the building, because they're not the ones who pay the energy, or there's other people using it, or, you know, it depends on the building type. So I think there's complications to standardization on the building scale compared to a vehicle.
We have time for one final question. I'd like somebody who hasn't asked a question before, if possible. Yeah.
That micro generation was going to be the energy revolution. And I think that's interesting because it goes along with a lot of other kind of trends in technology that we've seen. And it does have a lot of, you know, resiliency benefits, and it gives people, you know, individual control over their energy sources. But at the same time, the RPS for New York State right now is planning to get 98%, I think, of its renewable energy from large-scale generation. So I'm wondering, you know, we're at a time right now where we have an opportunity to kind of rethink the whole energy system, and I think it presents an opportunity also to, you know, strategize and think about, do we want large-scale generation, do we want micro-generation, and kind of how do we grapple with those issues at the same time as we're trying to be competitive and say, well, our state generates this much renewables versus your state. You know, who should be making those decisions, and how should that happen?
So I think there are a lot of concerns with the state RPS, and I was disappointed when they recently renewed it that they actually didn't change it. But the reason that 98% of it's coming from wind is it's the metric they're using is where do we get our bang for the buck in terms of you know, economies of scale. How do we get the most renewable energy capacity for the least amount of money? And large scale wind is the place you get that. What they're not considering is a different type of economics, and where's the bang for the buck in investment? You know, where is the cost of energy highest, and where are you impacting the most amount of people? And that's downstate in New York City. And while we can use our wind resources, we're not going to have the large wind farms that you're going to find on farms and ridges upstate New York. So I think the part of it is the economic indicator that they are using. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's why it's set that way, and that's why it's faulty. What would be more interesting is taking some of that money and figuring out how you reduce energy, put it more towards energy efficiency. Not that there's already a whole portfolio of programs and incentives to reduce energy in the city, but it could go further on one hand. And number two, put some of that money into the clean distributed generation in New York City. And yes, it's more expensive to put solar here. And yes, it's more expensive to do cogen, and everything's more difficult and more expensive here. But if you use the right indicator, it actually is the more cost-sensitive thing to do.
Final word, Bill?
No, I think that was a good piece on it. You know, we're in the midst of a really major transition in energy in the United States that has been more significant in the last few years than I think most of us actually realize. I mean, when we're seeing coal-fired power plants shut down, not because of environmental regulations, but because natural gas is so much cheaper than coal, when we're seeing two subsequent administrations, one put up $35 billion, the next one put up, I think it was this administration, $45 billion for nuclear, and not a single investment being made out of that pool, that's largely because, the best estimates are that's 9.5 cents a kilowatt hour electricity, when wind is cheaper than that currently, and natural gas is looking at, in many cases, 2, 3, 4 cents a kilowatt hour. We're in a really different, radically different world, and that shift happened really, really, really fast, and I think it caught a lot of us off guard. Coal going away, not because of regulation, but because it can't compete economically, is a very different world.
Well, I think we'll have to end it on that. I wanted to thank all of our speakers for a fascinating discussion from my perspective. Hope you enjoyed it. We didn't solve the world's problems in 90 minutes, but I think we came close. Bill, thank you. Ariella, Stephen, really fantastic. Also to Ted and Oldcastle and Mark and Columbia University. Thank you all for coming.